Before you start throwing with clay, it's very important that you prepare your clay properly for going on the pottery wheel. And the way we prepare our clay is by wedging it. So it's essentially just kneading the clay to get it to the right consistency. So all this is lovely clay fresh out of the bag, nice and moist, and you'll be working with clay like that as well in class. And so what you're going to do is you're going to take your clay, you're going to cut it with a wire. I don't know where the wire is. A wire like this, so it's like a piece of fishing line or a proper wire. And then you're going to measure the amounts of clay on like a little kitchen scale. The amounts don't need to be completely perfect and exact, but the more exact they are, the more consistent your pots will be. So I mean, right now it's not a problem, but as you move on in your potting career, you want to have pretty consistent weights in order to come up with the same sort of product. So these ones here, these are 800 grams, but we'll be starting off with 400 gram balls of clay to make little muggies with. And I will make up a list of clays and weights later. So anyway, to prepare your clay, you've got to wedge it. It's not fun, nobody likes wedging, but it's super essential. If you don't wedge your clay, you will end up with air bubbles, with inconsistencies where the clay is too wet and too dry. You will end up with pieces that kind of will warp off no matter how perfectly you make them. By the time they come out of the kiln, they'll be a bit skew if you don't wedge properly. And it is just good practice to start off with a really nice consistent ball of clay. And particularly when you're just learning how to deal with clay, it's very important to have well prepared clay. It just kind of makes it easier for you later on down the track when you're centering and pulling up your walls, if you don't have to deal with funny little pockets of super wet or super dry clay. So in order to, there's a few different methods that you can use to wedge. I'm just going to cover the ram's head first. So the idea of the ram's head, and this is what you would use for smaller amounts of clay, is that you are going to create a shape that looks like this. So the idea of it is like that's, you know, the ram's little eyes and his nose and his little horns. So the purpose of ram's head wedging, and all wedging in fact, is to thoroughly mix your clay without introducing any air bubbles. So in order to do that, you want to just do lots of small, tight motions. So what you're going to do is start off with, you know, you've got your amount of clay that you're going to work with, and you can just kind of start off by consolidating that down into something you can work with. Just slap them down, get it into a bit of a box shape. And then you're going to start off, you're going to put both of your hands on either side of the clay, like this, up the top. So the action of ram's head wedging is that you're really just pushing with this part of your hand, and you're pushing into the clay, and then you're picking it up onto the point that you've created. And you're pushing into the clay and picking it up, down into the clay and picking it up. And you're just repeating that motion. So you can see my hands are moving parallel to the work table. I'm not pushing down, shoving into the clay. I'm just pushing parallel like this. So your hands are making this kind of twisting motion, just pushing that into the clay. Okay, and then every time you roll the clay up onto the thin point, you're also using the sides of your hands on either side to compress that top thick bit back together, the horn part. So you're rolling up onto the nose and then pushing down, compressing it in again and up onto the nose. It's kind of hard to show you from this camera direction. but you want to end up with something like that. And what happens when you do this is, if I put a little plugget of clay at the top, I'm just going to make that motion. You can see that blob of clay has moved downwards. And I'm going to make that motion, and that blob of clay has moved down as well. And I'm going to do it again, and that blob of clay is here. So the clay is just spiraling around, and that the action of that helps to squeeze out any air bubbles. It helps to get any wet spots and any dry spots to fully incorporate together. And also the action of the spiraling is helping to line up all the platelets in the clay. So clay fresh from the bag is pretty good. That's been through a pug mill in the factory. It's quite nice and consistent. But when you're working with clay, you know, the next week on, you've thrown your clay, you've got some failures, you're putting it back in the bag. When you're working with that next bunch of clay, you will have a lot of air bubbles and inconsistency of moisture. So that's when wedging's super important. So I'm just going to keep going. You want to do this with fresh clay. I think you can get away with doing this sort of action about 20 times. When you're working with crappier clay, then maybe you need to be going like 40, 80, 100 times. You just keep working until that clay's feeling good. And then when you're coming to the end, you're just going to ease up, push way more gently, and you can see it's just created itself into this sort of brioche kind of shape. And then I'm just going to pat around the outside of that spiral in order not to trap any air bubbles. And just slap it into a ball. And then that ball's a nice place to start with on the wheel. So because on the pottery wheel we're making round objects, you're really going to help yourself if you start off with a round object to center. So that's fine, that's prepped. You want to, before you sit down at the wheel, you always want to wedge up a few balls of clay, because otherwise you have to keep stopping and getting up and wedging more clay. It's good to just like get it all done at once. So that is ram's head wedging. Yeah, okay, so some common mistakes with ram's head wedging are pushing too hard, and then you end up with this kind of smushy, elongated shape, pushing too hard, and then when you roll it up and you fold it over, you're trapping air inside that ball of clay. So if you do that, it's very easy to do. What you're doing is you're pushing with too much force down into the table. So you need to, again, like just keep those hands parallel. You're not squashing your clay down. The side of your hands are preventing that squash, and you're just pushing this part down into the clay, and also using this part here to keep the sides of your clay compressed. So if you do end up making a smushy little banana, that's fine. Just, you know, you can get it back into a good little shape to work with by just whacking that clay down, and then you re-wedge again. Another very common mistake is like the croissant. So the people are creating these like very strange elongated shapes, sort of like that. So that is when you're pushing down, you're not compressing it back together at the top again. So you're just kind of doing this sort of thing. I'm not making these funny little sausage things. I'm making nice tight little ram's heads. So again, just get your clay back together and start again. So when you do things like that, you're introducing air bubbles into the clay, and also the contact with your hands and the contact with the table surface is starting to dry out the clay. So you're actually making it more difficult and now you're going to have to wedge all those bubbles out and re-wedge all that moisture. So it pays to just start off gently and see how you go. So you just remember you want to compress it together at the top, push together. I'm actually putting more pressure on the sides as I roll up. I'm squeezing together. More pressure on the sides than I am on the downward stroke. Now, also, it pays to think about the surface that you're wedging on. So they recommend that the table is at your sort of thigh height that you're wedging on. Some people like to just get down on the floor on their knees and wedge. Particularly if you have kind of weakness in your upper body and your wrists and things, it's nice to be able to use like the weight of your body to wedge, and it's actually better practice to use your whole body for wedging than it is to just use your wrists and your arms. Yeah, wedging shouldn't hurt your body. I mean, clearly I'm a little bit puffed out. It's it's hard work, but you shouldn't experience pain from wedging. So let's quickly do that guy, smosh, smosh, pat, pat, pat. Here I'm patting from the outside to push that crease in, okay, and that's number 2. Okay, so that is ram's head wedging. There's tons of videos on the internet. Don't expect to get it right the first time. I mean, all of pottery is a hand skill, so you need to, really practice what's going on. Oopsie, fell on the ground. You need to just, let your body get used to it. It's like riding a bike. Once you've got the hang of it and you've got the real feel of it, then you'll have it forever. But give yourself the time and the patience to allow yourself to just really learn how to do it properly, and it will make a remarkable difference to your throwing. So if you've started throwing and you're finding that you're having issues like S-cracks, like when you're pulling up your walls, they're uneven, you've got your lips higher and lower and quite uneven, wedging is the first place to start with that. And you will find that a good wedge, that properly wedging, will smooth out a lot of the issues that you're having further on in your throwing. So it's a very important foundation for throwing a good pot. Okay, so there's those types of wedging, and I'll just quickly cover spiral wedging, and then I might do a separate one for slap wedging. So when you have a larger lump of clay, you need so doing a ram's head is going to be too hard on the wrists. Like, it's too much clay to be forcing downwards. You're really having to use your wrists and your elbows, not good for your body, and it's too much clay to deal with all at once. So when you've got a large amount of clay, it's better to spiral wedge. So for small amounts, do the ram's head. For larger, do the spiral. So the spiral takes a bit of practice, and you won't be there yet. That'll be for when you're later on more advanced in your practice. But the point of it is you're dealing with the clay in the same way that you would the ram's head, but instead of using both your hands into the clay, you're having your hands together at the top of the clay, and then both your palms are pushing down into that top corner. So it's like you're working on just one, sorry, my table's super squeaky. You're working on just one corner at a time. And again, you're working on that corner and then bringing it up onto the tip, and then working it and pushing the soft parts of your hands into that top, and it starts to create this sort of seashell-y spiral. can see, it's starting to spiral around, which is I guess why it's called a spiral wedge. So the spiral wedge is also really good for when you have very inconsistent clay. So you've spent a whole day throwing, you've got a whole lot of clay scraps that you need to recycle. The spiral wedge is really good for just working through your fresh clay and your old clay together. And if you do have very wet clay, you should work on an absorbent surface. So that will help to, if your clay's completely sloppy, you've been throwing all morning and you want to recycle it for the afternoon, there's plaster bats down at the clay shed that you can use. You can pour your own plaster bat. You can work on concrete that's absorbent. You can work on a piece of wood. A piece of jib is really good. It's nice to work on a surface that is heavy though. So I'm working on an old piece of kitchen bench top cut off. So I know even though the thing underneath is rubbling around, I'm not going to be picking up my wedging surface every time I put my clay down, which is going to make everything so much easier. Okay, this clay's a good consistency, so I don't need to, but I've got some other clay that I can use and just give you a little show. So I'm just going to spiral wedge, and again, when I'm feeling like that's good, I'm just going to ease off the pressure, and it's just going to make itself into a nice little cone shape. So you can see all these gruggly bits, you want to try and make sure you don't have any gruggly bits at the bottom, because you're going to put this on your wheel and throw with it, and you're not going to touch those bottom bits once you've thrown on the wheel. So I like to just kind of bash them out. And for larger amounts of clay, I do like to leave them in this sort of conical shape, just because that obviously helps you out once you get onto the pottery wheel. Okay. Alright, so that's spiral wedging. Ram's head wedging. We'll just quickly cover the cut and slap method. I'll get some different clay, I think. Oh, it's so heavy. Oh no, we'll use this. So cut and slap is good for when you are getting older, got a bit of wrist weakness, you are trying to mix together very dry clay and very wet clay. Cut and slap's really good for that. And the idea of the cut and slap method is that you're cutting your piece of clay in half. So you're just creating layers and layers of your platelets. And it is mixing the clay in the same way that spiraling the clay around and around does, but it's mixing it in a way that it what am I trying to say here? I don't actually know. It's another way of mixing the clay. I'll do some research and come back to you on that. So what you want to do is you cut your clay in half, you slam it down, and then you slam the other piece of clay on top. Okay, so now we've made 2 layers of platelets. Now I'm going to cut through the middle of that, and I'm going to slam it down and then slam the other clay on top. So it's the exponential doubling of the clay. So whereas before we had 2 layers, now we have 4 layers. I'm going to cut the clay, I'm going to slam it down, slam it down. So 2 layers, 4 layers, now we've got 8 layers. Woo. Now we've got 16 layers. My maths is terrible, I'm not going to be able to keep this up for long. 32 layers. 64 layers. 128, I think. Yes, I think that's right. Anyway, so you would go on, and the cutting, an exponential doubling of the clay is another way to really mix your clay together. So again, it's not like hugely practical for small amounts of clay like this. It's much easier to just wedge them. But when you're dealing with much larger amounts of clay, the cut and slap method is really good. And I am going to build down at the clay shed a proper cutting and slapping table. So you would have a hard surface like this, you'd have a rod sticking up and a wire coming right down the middle, so then you could just cut your clay through, slap, cut your clay through and slap, rather than having to use a wire by hand. And then once you have, so when you're doing the cut and slap, you probably want to go about, between 40 and 80 times. I think you really want to be spending a while cutting and slapping. And then once you've got your piece together, again you want to try and prevent introducing air bubbles. So you just really smooth all that stuff in. And then you do need to give it a quick little once over. So that's not enough slapping that I've done, but it gives you the idea. And you're probably better to go and have a little search on YouTube for the cut and slap method of wedging, and I'm sure there's somebody with a much better setup who's explained it much better than I have. Wedging. Yeah, so top points. Got a wedge. If you don't wedge, you're going to end up with air bubbles, weird inconsistencies, your pot's going to go off the wonk. Once you get better at throwing, you'll be able to deal with these on the actual wheel, but for now, you want to give yourself the best head start, and you're also going to prevent a lot of issues later on in the process. I mean, your faults don't always show up straight away in pottery. They can show up, you know, right at the end once your pot has been fired, and then suddenly you've got all these weird cracks and things, and almost always it's from improper preparation of the clay. So I'm just going to keep wedging this stuff up. And yeah, feel free to ask any questions in class, but yeah, there's a lot of, just so much hand skill in pottery. You just need to let your body learn the motions of doing these things properly. You just practice and practice and practice, and you'll get there eventually. Took me about a year and a half to properly get wedging, mostly because my heart wasn't in it, but it is not something you're going to master the very first time around. And just keep adjusting. Some balls of clay are drier, some balls are wetter. Just adjust the pressure you're putting. And you get the results you need. Is that one done? That one looks like it's done. I'll do it again. Groovy. Now we're ready to throw.